Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And as you can see, the topic for today is settling the lower colonies. And there will be a surprise extra bonus topic of the development of race and racism in the colonies. But before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, jot down the lecture outline at the bottom, and pay particular attention to those key words at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, as well as be able to connect the terms to each other and to their larger historical importance. Now that you got that, let's begin. Now you see, thus far, we've talked a lot about talked a lot about relations with Native Americans, but we really haven't talked about kind of that elephant in the room of colonial America, that is race. And the reason for that is that in early colonial America, again, 1607, 1620, race, the color of your skin, did not predetermine your specific experience as a colonist. It did not determine your equality. It did not determine your freedom. It did not determine your wealth. And at the same time, individuals who were of European ancestry, i.e. white, were not automatically free. Instead of race as a determining factor of freedom, wealth, etc., equality, what does determine it is your wealth. How much money you had, how much land you have. Wealth was the determining factor that would determine your wealth, your freedom, and your equality. So the concept of the term we would use to talk about this was known as colonial fluidity. In other words, there was an extreme amount of social, cultural fluidity within early colonial America. In other words, that means you can change your stars. You can change your status, your social economic status. Race does not dictate your freedom, and therefore all you have to do is change your economic circumstance to become accepted in society. However, by the end of the 17th century, race will become the determining factor. So for a large chunk of the 17th century, race was not the determining factor. It was about wealth, land. By the end of the 17th century, not only have we eradicated Indians in the colonies, pushed them onto reservations, etc., race also has become the determining factor for your equality, for your wealth, and for your life. Now, we're going to go into a lot of detail about this in a few minutes, but I want to talk first about this man right here, Anthony Johnson, and the invention of black and white. Because through this one man's experience, we can see the evolution of race and racism, the evolution of the economic labor system in colonial Virginia by looking at this one man's life. He embodies this concept of colonial fluidity. You see, he was an African, as you can see pictured, but he arrives to the Chesapeake region in 1621. So at this point, tobacco's been already been discovered. It grows well. We are a year away from the bankruptcy of the Virginia Company. He arrives at a pretty good time. Now, we don't know, so there's some things we don't know about him. We know he arrives in 1621 in Chesapeake. We don't know his exact status. We know he was not free, but we do not know if he was a servant, an indentured servant, we'll talk about in a few minutes, or that he was a slave. We're not quite sure. Either way, he was unfree. We know that, but we do know he was married. And we also know that both he and his wife are going to survive into late adulthood. They beat the odds in colonial Virginia. They avoid the urinated fecal water, and they will survive into adulthood. And they will have children who survive into adulthood. Again, they beat the odds and are very, very fortunate, very lucky. Remember the high mortality rate in colonial Virginia. We do know he worked in a tobacco field as unfree laborer. By 1630, we know that he's able to purchase his freedom. So this is not a caste system. Remember, race was not the determining factor, wealth was. He was able to earn money, he was able to purchase his freedom, and so in 1630 he buys his own freedom, and a few years later he purchases his wife's freedom. So by the mid-1630s, tobacco is booming. He and his wife are now free, as are their children. And by the mid-1630s, Anthony Johnson himself owns a large tobacco farm, large tobacco estate. He grew food, he grew obviously tobacco, and he needed lots of workers so he himself could make money. And you can see by the picture how well he's dressed. So obviously his sons worked the fields, but he needs additional help to help out. We know he was in charge of several unfree white laborers, white servants, as well as at least one African slave. Why? Because he doesn't care about his African brothers? No. Because race was not the determining factor. His servants could work hard and could purchase their freedom. So he felt he could deny the freedom of others based upon the wealth inequality gap. He had friends who were wealthy whites. He had friends who were free blacks in Virginia. He participated in colonial Virginia society just like any wealthy white person. Again, this is from 1640s, 1650s, 1660s, but by the 1670s, Anthony Johnson sees change going on around him that troubles him greatly. He is sensing attitudes of his neighbors changing. Some of his previous privileges as a wealthy person are denied. For example, he has to pay slightly higher taxes than his white wealthy friends. He loses his right to vote. Yes, as a black man, he was allowed to vote in colonial Virginia up to the 1670s. He suddenly was not able to own a firearm or a weapon. Now, Anthony Johnson's not stupid. He sees the writing on the wall, and he decides to get up and leave. He sells his farm, he moves away to maintain his freedom and equality. Now, the screen I have the screen that you see right here is what we call the evolution of slavery. This is what Anthony Johnson is experiencing here. So you see, it starts slow in 1662, Virginia slave laws. Children born to Negro women were free or bonded according to the condition of the mother. So, if a black woman was a slave, therefore her children were slaves. And if she became free, her children became free. Again, this is a small step, as you would call a slippery slope. And of course, 1667, now the baptism of slaves as Christians did not alter their status, because up to this point, remember, part of the mission was to civilize, Christianize the so-called savage people. And therefore, if you become Christian, you should become free, right? It made sense in colonial Virginia, but we'll talk about in a second why they need laborers. And of course, you see, if you go over to the second column over there, 1680s, slaves are prohibited from carrying weapons or leaving plantations without a pass. By 1691, any white man or woman who married a Negro, mulatto, or Indian was banished from Virginia. They want to create separation. By the way, if you don't know, a mulatto is a person mixed white and black. Why would they want to create this separation, though? That becomes the question. Why and how does this happen? We see the evolution here. We see what happens. But why does this happen? How does it happen? Why does Anthony Johnson, a person who was able to buy his freedom, participate as an equal in Virginia society, suddenly by the 1670s, early 1680s, have to leave? Why do things change? And quite honestly, it's going to be a phrase I'll use often, but it's the economy, stupid. In this case, it's tobacco. And as you can see here on this slide, we are going to vastly and quickly change. You see, by 1660, there are only 950 Africans in the Virginia population. Why? I mean, I'm sure many of you are sitting here thinking, well, didn't they use slave labor? Here's the thing. In the 1620s, tobacco is just starting to take off. And tobacco is the reason for this. Tobacco planters are booming, right? Tobacco is starting to boom. It's becoming a huge export. Talked about that a few lectures ago. It's a very labor-intensive crop. And there's a perpetual labor shortage problem. So in order to fix this problem, colonial Virginians who are growing tobacco have to ask the question, who do we get to do the work? Because they can't do it by themselves. Remember, people are dying hand over fist. So they look around at society and they say they have three options. And of course, if I would ask you this question right now, your first thing is, oh, slaves, gotta be slaves. Well, you see my screen. It's not slaves. So the first person they look to, of course, is Native Americans. They're the most readily available source. They're already looked down upon. And we already know colonists don't necessarily like them. So you get Native Americans. You try to force them into doing the labor for you. Well, there's some issues here. One's a language barrier, yes. One of the other big issues is disease. Natives are dying very quickly thanks to European diseases and the virgin soil epidemic issue we talked about back in lecture 1. In addition, they know the land. They have friends close by who are living outside those plantations. It is much more easily for them to run away and ultimately fight back as well because they can communicate well with neighboring tribes. So Indians, because they're A, don't want to, obviously, B, more susceptible to disease, and C, they know the land, they have friends close by, they can fight back and escape much more easily. Native Americans are a poor source of labor. So then we say, okay, use slaves. Fantastic, great idea, right? Wrong. You see, the problem with enslaving Africans is they're expensive. Remember, at this time, it would take more than a month to ship an enslaved African across the Atlantic Ocean. That's a lot of time to keep them alive, barely on the ship. And when they go into, it's hard to capture them in Africa. We'll talk more about that later, the process. And it makes enslaving Africans extremely expensive. And it's a supply and demand issue. There's a high demand for labor, but a very low supply coming from Africa at this point in the early 1600s. Up to about 1650, 1660, there's a very low supply. And therefore, they're expensive. And remember that high mortality rate in the Chesapeake area? Yeah, that urinated fecal water. The odds are, if you purchase an enslaved individual for a high price, statistically, they're going to die. Because you're going to work them hard, they're going to be already weak from that, and they're going to succumb to the diseases of the area. And therefore, as you see from my chart, only 3% of the population is possibly enslaved as an African. So therefore, you can't use Native Americans, you can't enslave Africans. Who can you use? Well, the answer would be poor white Europeaners. The problem is you are not allowed to enslave them. Following the plague in Europe, Britain and many other countries decided that Europeaners should never be enslaved. So they actually banished and barred slavery in Europe following the plague. And so rather than enslave them, they adopted a system known as indentured servitude. And you watched that video on Maryland last lecture, you heard about this term. Let's talk about this in a little more detail. So indentured servants were poor white people from Europe who couldn't afford the passage across the Atlantic. So what they did to entice workers was they said, okay guys, you can't afford it, great, fantastic. We will pay for you to come across the Atlantic. In exchange for this, you will sign a labor contract that you will agree to work with me for a period on average of 4 to 7 years. Now, we'll determine that beforehand, obviously, but as a definition of indentured servants, the contract was ranged from 4 to 7 years on average. Now, assuming you survive this 4 to 7 years, remember there is a risk because you are working hard, yes, but you are in colonial Virginia and there's a high mortality rate. Now, assuming you survive all this, at the end of your contract term, I, as your master, will give you what's called freedom dues. What are freedom dues, you ask? Well, upon the completion of your contract, I will give you new clothes, I will give you a new set of tools, and I will give you 50 acres of land. So, who out there wants to join me in this venture? Who wants to come work for me for 4 to 7 years? And when you're done, not only now you have a skill, you know how to grow crops, especially tobacco, I will give you 50 acres. I will give you tools. I will give you new clothes, and you will now be a landowner. What could be better? Sounds great, right? Oh, you know what? Just to entice the deal a little more, I'll even throw in tobacco seeds. So you can start growing some tobacco and make some money like I am. Hey, if you're like people back in Europe, you are excited about this. In fact, 80% though will be young males, poor, unskilled, work on the tobacco plantations. 20% would be female, who often are domestic workers in the home. Oh, sorry ladies, you will not get land assuming you survive your contract. You will get freedom though, it's not land. So who's with me? Anyone? Good? Here's the bad news. You're going to be treated like a piece of property. I'm going to give you the bare minimum of food just to keep you alive. I'll give you the bare minimum of shelter and clothing to survive. Again, any extra money I put into you is money out of my pocket. I don't care about you that much. Your life is going to be miserable. Remember, you're not being paid. Your only motivation is to survive. Because someday, within your contract, you will get your freedom dues. Oh, yeah, and by the way, don't ever cross me. If you run away, I'm going to add a year to your contract. If you steal from me because you're hungry, because I don't give you enough food, I'm going to add 6 months or a year to your contract. In fact, it got so bad in Virginia, the chronic stealing of hogs was actually 2 years added to your contract. Oh, ladies, if you get pregnant, we will add 2 years to your contract as well. Because, you have to 9 months of carrying the baby, plus another year or so to wean the baby and feed the baby breast milk. Even if the master was the father. Which means the person you signed a labor contract with, your master, could rape you, get you pregnant, and use that as a pretense to extend your contract 2 more years. Yeah, life was not good. And conditions were very harsh, obviously, but the possibility to own your own land was so enticing that up to 75% of the people that arrived in the Chesapeake will show up as indentured servants. Think about that. Those hundreds of thousands of people that show up, many who die, 75% of them will show up as indentured servants for this ultimate English goal of owning land. Now, there are some problems with this besides the work conditions, but we're going to take a break right here and break this lecture up into 2 halves to make it a little more digestible. So we'll stop right here. When we come back, we'll talk about a few problems associated with indentured servitude. But until next time, take care and bye-bye.